You know that moment when everyone else seems to be sharing something online? Photos from dinners, quick updates about their day, thoughts about the news, little fragments of life posted into the endless stream. And you're there, watching, scrolling sometimes, maybe even enjoying what others share. But when it comes to posting something yourself, your finger hesitates above the screen. Not because there's nothing to say, but because something inside you quietly asks, do I really want to put this out there? Most people don't notice this difference, and when they do, it's often misunderstood. People who rarely post on social media are sometimes labeled as distant, private, even antisocial. Friends might joke that you've disappeared from the internet. Others might assume you're simply not interested in connecting. But what they're often missing is that this behavior isn't about disconnection at all. It's about a different relationship with attention, expression, and identity. And once you understand the psychology behind it, the pattern starts to make a lot more sense. Because people who rarely post on social media often share a subtle psychological trait that isn't immediately obvious. They tend to process life internally before they express it externally. In other words, instead of broadcasting experiences as they happen, they absorb them first. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as a more internalized processing style. Studies on personality and attention patterns have found that some people naturally lean toward external sharing. They think by expressing things out loud. Others tend to do the opposite. They think quietly. They reflect before they reveal. And for people with this internal processing style, social media can feel slightly out of sync with how their mind works. The pace of most online platforms rewards immediacy, quick reactions, instant updates, constant visibility. But the internal mind works differently. It pauses, it observes. It asks questions like, what does this moment actually mean to me? And by the time that answer forms, the impulse to post often fades away. Neuroscience offers another interesting layer to this. Research on dopamine and reward systems shows that social media engagement, likes, comments, notifications, activates the brain's reward circuitry. For some people, this feedback loop becomes very stimulating, but for others, the reward isn't as strong, not because something is wrong with their brain, but because their nervous system finds satisfaction in different places. Instead of external validation, their sense of completion often comes from internal clarity. A meaningful conversation, a moment of understanding, a private experience that doesn't need an audience. So when they take a photo of something beautiful or notice something meaningful during the day, the instinct isn't always to share it. Sometimes the instinct is simply to experience it. And this tendency often develops long before social media ever enters the picture. If you look at someone's life history, you'll often find patterns that quietly shaped this relationship with expression. Some people grew up in environments where being overly visible attracted criticism or judgment. Others learned early that privacy created a sense of safety. And over time, the nervous system adapts. It learns to hold experiences internally rather than projecting them outward. This doesn't mean these individuals are secretive, and it doesn't mean they lack openness. It simply means their comfort zone sits slightly closer to the boundary between private and public space. In behavioral psychology, this is sometimes described as a preference for controlled exposure. Instead of sharing moments with hundreds or thousands of people, they share selectively. One conversation, one trusted person, one meaningful exchange. And to them, that can feel far more authentic than broadcasting a moment to a wide audience. Of course, none of this makes one approach better than another. Some people feel energized by sharing their lives openly. Social platforms become a place where they build community, connection, and creativity. For others, quiet presence feels more natural. Both patterns reflect different ways of navigating the same human need, the desire to be understood. But here's where things get interesting. People who rarely post on social media often carry a subtle paradox. On one hand, they may feel perfectly comfortable remaining in the background. On the other, they're extremely observant of everything happening around them. They notice tone shifts in conversations. They remember small details others overlook. They quietly absorb emotional dynamics in a room. Psychologists sometimes call this high observational awareness, and individuals with this trait often realize something that frequent posters don't always think about. When you share something online, you're not just expressing yourself, you're also shaping how others perceive you. Every post becomes a small piece of identity construction. For some people, that process feels natural. For others, it feels strangely incomplete. Because identity, in their experience, is something that evolves quietly over time, not something that needs constant documentation. So instead of presenting their life moment by moment, they allow it to unfold privately. And ironically, this can create a quiet strength. While many people feel pressure to constantly maintain an online presence, those who rarely post often feel less tied to that cycle. Their sense of self becomes slightly less dependent on external response, less shaped by algorithms, less defined by how others react in real time. But that independence also comes with a quiet cost, because the modern world increasingly assumes that visibility equals participation. If you're not posting, some people assume you're absent. If you're not sharing updates, they assume nothing is happening. And yet, for many people who rarely post, their life is anything but empty. It's simply happening in spaces that don't always leave digital traces, in conversations that never appear in comment sections, in moments that exist fully and then disappear. And if you recognize yourself in this pattern, there's something important to understand. This tendency doesn't mean you're disconnected. It doesn't mean you're behind the times. And it certainly doesn't mean there's something wrong with how you relate to the world. It simply means your mind might be wired for depth before display, for experience before expression, for meaning before visibility. In a world that often encourages constant sharing, that kind of inner pacing can feel unusual, but it also reflects a different kind of awareness, the kind that quietly asks whether every moment needs an audience, or whether some moments become more meaningful precisely because they remain yours. And if this way of moving through the world feels familiar, there are often other patterns connected to it. Subtle traits that tend to appear together, ways of thinking, observing, and processing life that many people carry quietly without realizing there's a psychological explanation behind them. And once you start noticing those patterns, you may begin to understand yourself in ways that were never fully explained before. Because sometimes the behaviors we question the most about ourselves are simply signals of how our mind has learned to move through the world. And when you see that clearly, a lot of things begin to make sense.